Living is supposed to feel like the end of something hard. At least that's what most people assume. So when someone leaves a relationship and things suddenly intensify, more calls, more pressure, more fear, instability, it can be deeply disorientating. And often the person leaving is asking themselves, why does this feel worse now? Because we've been taught that separation ends the problem. But sometimes separation exposes it. We've seen again and again how relationship breakdown can become the point where hidden dynamics turn visible and the consequences can become devastating. And when this happens, the question most people tend to ask is, why didn't it just leave sooner? But nobody is asking what actually happens when someone finally decides to leave. Welcome back to Family and Beyond. I'm Delalu, family lawyer, qualified mediator, and legal coach. Today, we're talking about one of the most misunderstood realities in high conflict and coercive relationships. Why the moment of leaving can also become the moment of the greatest risk. We are looking at why, in some cases, leaving is not the end of the danger, but the point at which it sharpens. And to be clear, not every difficult breakup involves abuse, and not every painful separation is coercive control. But when coercive control is present, separation changes the emotional and psychological dynamic completely, because the person losing control often experiences separation as a threat. And the distinction matters. It matters legally, it matters emotionally, and in some situations, it matters in immediate, serious ways. To help us unpack the legal, emotional, and relational realities underneath this, I'm joined by Bola, a lawyer whose work brings valuable insight into family dynamics, conflict, and the realities people face when separation becomes complicated. I'm really glad you're here.
Thank you.
So one of the biggest misconceptions people have is that once someone leaves, the danger is over. But in practice, that's not always what happens. So as a lawyer, what have you seen about the way prolonged conflict and divorce can weigh people down psychologically, even when the warning signs are not obvious to others?
I think in these situations, there's a lot of nuance. We remain in a bad situation for a long period of time. But basically, whenever you do decide to make that decision, I assume that would be the right time in that moment. From my perspective and based on what I've seen in practice, there needs to be a lot of thought and planning to when you leave, because you don't actually know what's going to happen in terms of the realities that is going to occur, especially if you've been in a relationship where coercive control has been a pattern. You're most likely you've lost yourself in the process. And again, you may not know this until after that separation. I like to see it as living is the beginning of the real test. But if you plan ahead of time, putting a lot of thought into that exits, you're going to be a lot more successful and prevent the likelihood of return to the abusive relationship.
And, I like the way you've broken that down because, again, what we see when we have this dynamic is there is prolonged conflict. People get into litigation fatigue, they are typically emotionally exhausted, and the control just continues. And so the distinction shows up all the time. After separation, you see your client talking about, I feel I'm being monitored. I think I'm being stalked. I think I'm being recorded. So the emotional part intensifies, and that can seem quite chaotic. From the outside, I know people sometimes describe this as, oh, they're just struggling emotionally. But there is a real difference between grief and a pattern of control we are trying to access or regain their autonomy after separation. When someone comes to you for a consultation, for example, and they are saying, I'm planning to leave, I'm still in this relationship, what kind of advice would you give this kind of person?
I think it depends on exactly what the circumstances are. So, I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that new Supreme Court case that talks about coercive control, where now people can get damages for family violence of all types. So my advice, if family violence is involved, would be document incidents as much as possible. Because when I say family violence, for the benefit of people who don't know, it doesn't necessarily mean physical assault alone. It could also be emotional and psychological, so to speak, all those unhealthy relationship patterns that you may have. If you're able to document them, document them. So if I do have a potential client that comes to me for consultation wanting to know what do they do, how do they do it, my first advice would be for them is document as much as possible. If there have been name calling in text messages, have it documented. Document it, because those are things that I believe would make a huge difference in your case down the line.
And you're absolutely correct in that. One of the other situations we see in this dynamic is because they're so used to this pattern of behaviors, they tend to minimize these behaviors. So sometimes they can't even decipher exactly what is going on because it's become a normal situation. Sometimes they can't interpret constant texting being problematic until it gets escalated, demanding explanations for everything, their guilt, showing up at places unexpectedly, using children as leverage, the financial pressure, especially maybe one person having more financial stability, and then just refusing to respect boundaries of the other person, regardless of they trying to set this boundary for their own overall mental health. So again, I know we see this all the time, but part of it is also the constant boundary violation and then using the children as a pawn. Again, this is where people start doubting themselves. And often people are waiting for something to get really serious before they realize exactly what's going on. So I want to pause here and just think about what people often judge quite harshly, right? Sometimes we have these clients come to us and say, I'm ready for a separation. I've been through this couple of years. I'm tired. The kids are seeing the violence. And then you don't hear back from them. And then you hear subsequently they've returned back to the same relationship, right? And then the society says, well, because this person has returned back to this dynamic, this abusive relationship, maybe that's just proof that there's really no harm. Like there's really no violence. There's really nothing going on. There's nothing complex about this. So when you have someone like that return, how do you talk about codependency, for example? The financial constraints. Maybe one person is a stay-at-home mom, they're not working, and they find it difficult to get financial support because, again, the resources are not there. And they're also worried about what will happen to their children because they don't know how to navigate it. So even though they've spoken to you, they've returned back to this situation. How do you advise this kind of clients?
I mean, I think it's very difficult where people come and, they've had a pattern of separating and going back, separating and going back. At the end of the day, my advice is if you don't have proper planning, you're going to fail. Okay. So you have to plan properly. And it may very well be a situation where a little bit of separation just to get a breather, depending on how extreme the circumstances are, is what you need to take you to that next point where you're ready to make the final move. So it really is difficult when you have people who want to make this decision. They've been sleeping on it for a while, but they can't, or they're afraid to make it. You can take a horse to the river, you cannot force it to drink water. You're ready when you're ready, but you need to plan. You need to seek legal advice. There are lots of lawyers in town that offer free legal advice if it's a situation where you can't afford it. But even if it's a situation where you get to pay for that legal advice, for me, it's a worthwhile investment because
Right.
you do need that information from a legal perspective, what you need to do to help you be more successful so you're not repeating that pattern of behavior and putting yourself in a situation where you remain in it for such a long time that it's almost pointless bringing it up when you eventually get to court, because the other side can say, you see, she kept going and coming back. It means that it couldn't be that bad, because I mean, the reality is, yes, the justices don't live with you, the lawyers don't live with you. They can only go based on what you tell them, right? But remember, for your version of events, there's also the other side's version of events. If you have already established a pattern of going and coming, that could create a problem for your case. So plan, seek legal advice, even if you have to go back to the same lawyer to ensure that, okay, this is what I've done so far since the last time I saw you. Am I ready? Right? And based on whatever the situation is, it might be a situation where you get a lawyer actually say, yeah, you've already put all of these things into thoughts. I think that if you make the move now, you will be successful.
That is very helpful. And again, you said something important there. Yeah, getting legal advice can seem expensive, but as you correctly said, there are tons of lawyers that provide free legal advice. You do a consultation, get your information together. They would explain the kind of things to record in terms of documentation. Because again, in the legal setting, that complexity of leaving and going back is often used against survivors of domestic violence, especially after years of adaptation, fear, guilt, isolation, dependency. Things can be quite challenging.
And can I just jump in real quick? Just to add to that is that psychological harm is difficult to prove in court. So there could be patterns of behavior, but honestly, the evidence is going to really rest on not only the patterns of behavior that you can explain, but also the evidence that you have, the actual hard evidence that you have. So which is why I say document as much as possible. Make sure that you're not in a position where you are vulnerable for more family violence if the other person catches that you're recording them.
And so we're clear, this would include text messages, abusive messages that tries to establish a pattern, the gaslighting that you have to endure every day, the constant phone calls, the intimidation. Those are things that we're talking about. And, when it comes to recording, the intention is not to also trigger, because we've had family law matters whereby the parties are arguing, one person flips out a phone, and instead he escalates the situation, and then things get worse. So then you become the person having to explain yourself because you look like the person triggering the situation. So that's where we have to be very strategic. One of the things we talk about often in family law is how quickly children can get pulled into these dynamics. Not always intentionally, but they begin carrying emotional weight that should never have been theirs to hold in the first place. They become emotional support for one parent. They are the sources of information. They become loyalty holders of one parent who they feel maybe is more vulnerable. And often these children don't know how to handle these situations. So again, let's talk about how children are drawn into conflict during separation and why emotional strain on children matters.
Do you want me to talk about those situations?
Yeah, how can people prevent these scenarios if they can at all?
So, look, one of the things you really want to avoid is discussing legal matters with children. Discussing not just legal matters with children, but adult matters, any conflict between yourself and your partner, avoid it as much as possible. But you also want to ensure that you're recognizing from your children if they're coming to tell you something that you haven't told them and they shouldn't know, especially as far as your relationship and potential separation is concerned. Again, these are things that would need to be documented. You don't want to contribute to that because these situations can cause irreparable harm on your children. So you really want to avoid it, but you also want to be attentive. You know yourself and you know what you can or cannot do. But if you're dealing with a partner who doesn't care, who is just out there to hurt you, and if he can't hurt you directly, hurt you through the children of the relationship, then you really want to just watch out for the pattern. Are the kids being involved in situations where there is extreme emotional outburst, certain things being discussed or initiated by the other person that should not be discussed in the presence of the children. How are the kids doing in school? If their teachers have, observed anything different from their behavior and the things that they say. These are things that could be a trigger for you to seek help, whether the kids would need counseling, whether it's not getting to a point where decisions now have to be made, because you could be in that situation where you're being separating and making up, and you've been thinking of leaving for a very long time, but you haven't had the courage to do it. Now, you being in that relationship for that long is now beginning to affect your children. I often just tell my clients, you really have to put your children's best interests first.
Absolutely.
Put them in the planning. They're going to be part of the planning. Just because your relationship doesn't work does not mean the other person is not a competent parent, right? And it could possibly also be that the other person is not a competent parent, not really watching out for the children's best interest. So when you're doing your planning, you really need to be ensuring that you are also looking at it from the perspective of the children. What are the steps that you need to take to protect them? Do they need to get counseling? Because these are all of the things that you want to present before a lawyer to help if you now decide to move forward, going to either court or mediation or anything like that.
Right. And as we've seen recently, I mean, family courts are increasingly being asked to look beyond obvious incidents and assess the broader emotional and psychological environment around the child, not just for physical safety, but emotional regulation, the communication patterns and psychological safety. Because even when children cannot name the legal issue, they can still feel the instability around them. So we've had situations whereby one parent is crying in front of the child, or you find maybe one parent accusing the other parent of certain abuse that doesn't even exist in order to prove a point. So people sometimes, when trying to get at each other, are not in any way thinking about how their actions are impacting the children psychologically.
Yeah, and they may actually be the victim.
True.
Still doesn't mean your children should be the audience for your emotional distress. So they're kids. You really want to avoid that because it could actually backfire. Because I mean, if the kids see you crying, there's no way they're not going to ask, mommy, daddy, whatever it is, what's wrong with you, right? You really want to avoid putting those kids in that environment so that you don't have to explain that to a court or a judge later in future.
Right. So let's talk about legal realities and danger assessment. One of the most important things danger assessment training reinforces for lawyers is separation itself can increase risk, and especially where there is stalking, obsessive communication, threats, access to weapons, which we see often, intense jealousy, and refusal to accept the relationship is ending. So sometimes some people say, yeah, it's coming to an end. Yes, that's fine. However, they don't accept it in reality. And this is reflected in their actions, which is why serious planning and support is always essential for the person who is living. So talking about warning signs, separation risk, and how things escalate pretty quickly, how do you advise the client?
My advice is always never feed the beast. You have an opposing party, mother or father of your children, that is constantly texting you, trying to reach out, whether it's necessary, whether it's not necessary, whether it has something to do with the kids, whether it does not have something to do with the kids. I found people sometimes will say, oh, because I didn't want to make things worse, so I respond, I allowed him to come over, or I did this and I did that. Even where law enforcement gets involved, people are not really able to see clearly that this is an abusive relationship. So my advice or suggestion is ensure you are not letting the other side drag you into their drama. Let your yes be your yes, your no be your no. If somebody's texting you, just if they're texting you excessively, you don't need to respond. I mean, depending on what the content of the text is, you don't need to respond. If it does not have anything to do with your children, that you share, don't engage. It's very tempting not to, but that is usually my advice. I think this is why podcasts such as this is important, because sometimes you need to hear things over and over again to be able to develop that strength to make those decisions. Of course, you need to have a support system, but the reality is some people don't have that. They don't. They don't have it, or in situations where they have family around, they don't have people they can trust enough to be that vulnerable. So for the benefit of people who are not in that situation yet, my advice would be, if somebody is trying to isolate you from your family and your friends, that person is problematic.
So one of the problems we often see is that people that are in this dynamic no longer have the support system that would have helped. So often you see someone say, well, she doesn't like my friends. I don't really talk to them anymore. Or he doesn't like my family. So I don't really talk to them anymore. So when they are ready or make that decision to leave and they need that support, they don't have it because the people they would have spoken to ordinarily are no longer there. They haven't spoken to them for a while. So in this situation, I say, join a community or talk to a therapist, get some advice, because it's difficult doing this on your own. Like I've said earlier, if you've been in this kind of dynamic for a long time, it's difficult for you who is in it to see, because we tend to excuse these bad behaviors until it gets to a point where you can't anymore and you make that decision to leave. So again, where financial constraint is a problem, you can't just say, I'm going to opt and leave because there's restriction or there's been emotional conditioning such that it's difficult for you to even decipher, well, I think, this is such a bad scenario because you're so used to it. And again, there's a community shaming as well because you don't want it to seem like you failed or like you didn't try hard enough. Conditioning is a big part of it because, again, you've been conditioned to act in a certain way. And if something fails, it is your responsibility. So helping people understand that part in making that decision, I think is also crucial. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I was just going to add that just on the point of community shaming. So, I mean, of course, you need to reach out to your community, but in a situation where you've been isolated from them for a very long time, it might not be so easy to just give them a call because feelings have already been hurt. And I mean, you could possibly have people who would open the door right away, like they understand the situation, but you might have people who don't understand the situation. They're like, oh, you need us now. Now you remember us, right? So I know that there are some organizations, like in Fuck My Prayer, for example, yeah, they had the women's shelter, those types of organizations in Calgary, like Elizabeth Fry. But there are some organizations like that actually offer family support, right? Like depending on your situation, they could assign a person to you to sort of be your support. I think they call them family support is what's jumping in my head, but I may be wrong. But they have people they could assign to you. So if you don't have a community or your community is far away, those types of organizations, reach out to them. They would have people that they can assign to your case that could assist you through this journey and be that emotional support for you. I mean, of course, they can't help you deal with somebody who is trying to control you financially, but at least you guys can sit down and exchange some ideas. The same thing with a therapist. A therapist might also be in a situation where they can offer you some information on what is available in the province, like organizations that you could reach out to that can actually offer you tangible help. For example, if you're trying to leave, some people would say, I don't want to go to a shelter, right? They may have kids, shelter might not be appropriate. But when you speak to your therapist or you go through some of these organizations, they may actually have a place or two they could recommend for housing, because that would take a lot off your shoulders, as if you can have a place to put a roof over your head, somewhere where you can breathe and start actually executing your plans will be helpful. But yeah, if you don't have immediate community support, I always encourage people that come to me for advice to reach out to some of those organizations.
Yes, that's definitely helpful, having those organizations to reach out to. And, honestly, I always say people in this situation should try as much as possible to not mistake planning for panic. This is strategic planning, right? And, planning safely is not overreacting. Documentation is also not overreacting. Reaching out for support is not overreacting. It's just a strategy, which usually is very essential.
A popular saying is, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
Absolutely.
Or maybe it's the other way.
If you fail to plan,
You
you
plan to fail.
plan to fail,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So, for someone listening right now, feeling confused, emotionally exhausted, afraid to make a move, or constantly second guessing themselves as a result of the history, as a result of the patterns of abuse, can you say 3 things you want them to know or you want them to hear as we move forward?
You're not alone. There are lots of people in similar situations. There is help out there. You just need to reach out to get the help. One of the places you could go to is seeking legal advice. Thirdly, don't be too hard on yourself. People change. You may not have seen all of the what's the word
Red flags.
red flags from the beginning. Lots of things changes the dynamic of a relationship. So don't be too hard on yourself. You're not alone, and there is help out there.
Absolutely. That is so helpful. Thank you so much, Bola. And I want to leave listeners with this. Leaving does not always immediately restore clarity. Sometimes before things make sense, the confusion gets louder because once someone begins pulling away from control, the system would react.
Right.
The other person would react. But confusion does not mean you're weak, and it does not mean you're imagining things. So if there's one thing I hope you take from today's episode, it is this. Living a relationship does not always end control. It is important to remember that. Sometimes it reveals how much control was there in the first place. And if separation feels destabilizing, frightening, or profoundly confusing, please do not navigate this alone. There is strength in support, there is wisdom in planning, and there can be clarity on the other side of that confusion. So thank you so much for joining us today, Bola. I hope we've been able to help a lot of people navigating this situation.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on the Family and Beyond podcast. This is season 2, where we're talking about clarity, choices, and consequences. On to the next episode.